we all have a personality, right? It's that special something that makes you, well, you. But what happens when that unique blueprint gets stuck, when it stops adapting and becomes rigid? So today, we're going to talk about exactly that. We're diving deep into the world of personality disorders. I mean, really think about it. What makes you you? It's your personality. It's that whole unique mix of traits that shapes how you act, how you feel, and even how you think. It's kind of like your own personal operating system for navigating the world. Okay, so let's get right to the heart of this, because this is really the core idea of our whole explainer. The biggest single difference between a healthy, adaptive personality and one that's causing real problems, it all comes down to one simple word: flexibility. And you can see that contrast perfectly right here. A flexible personality, that's someone who learns, who adapts. Think of it like a river flowing around rocks in its path. But a personality disorder, well, that's defined by rigidity. It's this enduring, inflexible pattern that just gets in the way of life, messes with relationships, and causes some real psychological pain. And this isn't some super rare thing we're talking about. I mean, look at this number. Estimates suggest that anywhere from 9 to 13% of all adults could have a personality disorder. That's roughly 1 out of every 10 people, which really shows you why it's so important we talk about this and understand it better. So, how do clinicians even begin to make sense of these rigid patterns? Well, the current official playbook, so to speak, is the DSM-5. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's kind of the main guide for the whole field. And right now, it groups all the personality disorders into 3 distinct buckets, or clusters. Let's take a look at what those are. So here's the breakdown. You've got Cluster A, that's the odd or eccentric group. Then there's Cluster B, which covers the dramatic, emotional, or erratic disorders. And finally, Cluster C, which is all about anxious or fearful behaviors. Now, to make this less abstract and a lot more real, let's pull out one concrete example from each cluster and see what it actually looks like. Okay, first up from Cluster A, let's talk about paranoid personality disorder. And this is way, way beyond just being a little cautious. We're talking about a deep, pervasive distrust of pretty much everyone. Now, a really key point here is that this suspicion isn't usually delusional. The person hasn't lost touch with reality, but their interpretation of that reality is just completely colored by this intense mistrust. And you can see right here how that distrust actually plays out in real life. Someone with this disorder is often super critical of other people, pointing out their weaknesses and faults, but they have a really hard time recognizing their own mistakes. This constant suspicion just makes them seem cold and distant, and they're known for holding on to grudges for a long, long time. All right, let's move on to Cluster B, the dramatic group. And here, we're going to look at borderline personality disorder. This is actually one of the more commonly diagnosed ones. And if you had to sum it up in one word, it would be instability. We're talking about profound, major instability. And this instability, it just creates these incredibly challenging experiences day in and day out. So you see these really intense, conflict-heavy relationships that are just fueled by this deep, powerful fear of being abandoned. That emotional roller coaster can lead to impulsive anger, which is often directed inward through things like self-harm and other reckless behavior. And last but not least, from the anxious Cluster C, we have avoidant personality disorder. This is a pattern defined by this extreme discomfort in social situations, just being overwhelmed by feelings of inadequacy, and this absolutely paralyzing fear of being judged negatively. Okay, now listen up, because this is a really crucial distinction. This is not the same thing as social anxiety. See, someone with social anxiety might be afraid of social situations, like a party or public speaking. But a person with avoidant personality disorder, they fear the actual relationships. They have this core belief that they are somehow unappealing or inferior, and that drives them to avoid intimacy, which, as you can imagine, often leaves them with very, very few close friends. So we've got these 10 disorders all sorted into 3 nice, neat boxes. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Yeah. Well, in the real world, it's anything but. In fact, this whole system of putting people into categories is under some pretty intense debate. Which brings us to the big question here. Does sorting the incredible complexity of a human being into one of just 10 little boxes, does that actually work? And a growing number of experts are saying, no, it doesn't. And here's why. For starters, the symptoms just overlap like crazy. It can be incredibly hard to tell one disorder from another. It's actually really common for a person to fit the criteria for more than one at the same time. Then you add in the fact that these diagnoses can be pretty subjective, depending on the clinician. And you start to see why there are some really serious concerns about the reliability and validity of this whole box approach. Okay, so if the boxes approach has all these problems, what's the alternative? Well, a lot of theorists are pushing for a totally new way of thinking about this, a big shift away from rigid categories and towards something much more flexible, dimensions. And this slide really nails the difference. The old way, the categorical approach, is like a light switch. A disorder is either on or it's off. You have it or you don't. But the dimensional approach, that's more like a dimmer switch. It sees personality traits as existing on a spectrum, a continuum. The idea is we all have these traits. The real question is just how much of it do we have? And is that level causing problems in our life? So the whole question just flips, It's not do you have it anymore. The new question is, okay, how much of this trait do you have? And how much is it really getting in the way of your life? It's just a much more nuanced, much more personalized way of looking at things. And this whole dimensional idea, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It's actually grounded in a really well-researched, widely accepted model of personality called the Big Five. This theory basically says that you can break down the vastness of human personality into 5 core super traits, which you can see right here. And it's this very framework that's inspiring this new diagnostic approach. So all this dimensional thinking led to a really specific formal proposal for the latest DSM-5. It's called Personality Disorder Traits Specified, or PDTS for short. And it's basically a model designed to take this whole spectrum idea and make it something clinicians can actually use day to day. So how would it work? Well, it's basically a 3-step process. Step 1, the clinician would assess the severity of impairment, like how much is this really impacting the person's life. Step 2, they'd identify which of 5 main problematic trait groups are actually present. And then finally, for step 3, they'd rate the degree of dysfunction for each of those traits on a scale. What you end up with is a much more detailed, much more individualized picture of what's going on. Now, it's important to know this PDTS model, it wasn't officially adopted into the main section of the DSM-5, but the debate it kicked off is so valuable because it's a huge reminder that science isn't static. Our understanding of the human mind is not some finished book sitting on a shelf. It's a story that is actively being written, and we are constantly learning and revising what we think we know. And all of this whole debate, it leaves us with a really fascinating and tricky final question to think about. Where exactly do we draw the line between just a personality quirk and a clinical disorder? And maybe even more importantly, who gets to draw that line? Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this one.